We need to have a real talk about the future of live streaming, specifically 120 FPS streaming. This is a notion that people started kind of murmuring about a few years ago, and back then, 2018, 2019, it seemed kind of ridiculous. Like, why would anyone want that? And then over the past couple years, we've seen the hints of innovations towards that dynamic for live streaming. We've seen Twitch get heavily invested in the future of AV1, an open source video streaming codec that requires significantly less video bandwidth to maintain quality, which would benefit live streaming services in a plethora of ways. And a lot of other companies have jumped on board, and there's plenty of YouTube videos now in AV1, and Netflix is streaming it now, so we're slowly getting to that point, but encoding it is still kind of inaccessible. It was always assumed that 120 FPS streaming, which was something Twitch used for their AV1 demo, demoing 1440p 120 at one point as well, it was assumed we'd have to wait for AV1 for 120 FPS streaming to be viable in terms of quality and bandwidth and everything else. But that was also in terms of encoder performance. And in my previous video, I showed that the Intel 12th gen Alder Lake, the 12900K, can stream 1080p 120 FPS on slow, which suddenly kind of rushes everyone who can get their hands on it to the forefront of 120 FPS streaming. And the 12600K, the $300 CPU, it's no slouch either. See, the difference is, in my previous video, when I was talking about the 12900K, that was an $800 CPU. There's a lot of people who ask for the best of the best, and they will pay for it, and that's fine, but that's not super accessible to most people. $300 CPU, on the other hand, is way more reasonable. So today we're going to talk about the future of 120 FPS live streaming, what's needed to make that happen, why you may or may not want it at all, and of course the performance of the 12600K along with it. We just released Forerunner, our Halo-themed backing track album of music that you can use in your videos and streams. If you're unaware, I have a music service called Backing Track, which is royalty-free music that you can use in your streams, videos, podcasts, things like that. Free to use, free to download. You can check it out at backingtrack.gg. Free downloads are available on our Discord server at discord.gg/EposVox. And we just released 2 new albums over the past couple months. The first is Versus 2, which is the sequel to one of our most popular albums that we have released to date. And secondly, we have Forerunner, which is a Halo Infinite themed album that has some really awesome Halo vibes, some hard rock and metal going, and I've been using it for my Halo Infinite streams, and it is awesome. So if you're a fan of Halo or you like the kind of music we're putting out, go check out the new album. And if you've never heard of it before at all, now's your chance. Again, that's backingtrack.gg, where we have all the services that you can stream it from, and it's on pretty much everything at this point, and then discord.gg/EposVox for the downloads, stems, things like that. Happy streaming. I'm EposVox, the stream professor, and I previously reviewed the 12900K. If you missed that review, it will be linked below. And we were doing some experimentation on Twitch, streaming different formats, 936p, 720p, 540p, 240 for the lulz, 1080p 120, and doing dual PC streams with that CPU, trying to see how far we could push it, what the future of, high frame rate streaming looks like, and had some people with high refresh rate screens in there, seeing that it looked incredibly smooth on their end. Like, it was one thing when I was doing my benchmark tests and seeing it recorded locally and being like, yeah, that's cool, but to actually see it playing back that smoothly on Twitch was mind-blowing. And something that we also got into was dual PC by hooking it up to my Xbox Series S, streaming at 120 FPS, and seeing that it actually looked really, really good there as well. Well, of course, again, the topic came up that Intel's 12900K is a wonderful CPU, but it's very, very expensive. So we wanted to see how the cheaper model would do. So I had access to the 12600K. This is a $300 CPU. Of course, it has fewer cores. It puts out a lot less heat though, so I was able to use the Noctua NH-U12S and U14 for cooling it. Shout out to Noctua for sending over the hardware to adapt their coolers to the newer, because it's actually a newer bracket. The CPUs themselves are actually longer now. This is LGA 1700. And then shouts out to Corsair for sending out their Vengeance DDR5 RAM, which runs at 5200 megatransfers per second. Asus sent over their Z690E Wi-Fi motherboard for me to set up my test bench. Things are off to the races. Also, huge shoutouts to Kingston for sending out their new Fury NVMe SSD that I use for my boot drive for my test bench here. Kingston Fury is back. Now, the benchmarking that I did in the last video takes a ridiculous amount of time, and honestly, it's a bunch of numbers thrown up on screen that not a lot of people care about, so I didn't want to waste as much time with that today, but I wanted to talk about what the CPU could actually do. Because the 12900K, in most games that I tested, and especially in a dual PC scenario, was completely capable of streaming 1080p 120 FPS on X264 slow, whereas its predecessors couldn't even stream 1080p 60 at slow without a ton of dropped frames for encoding lag. So immediately it's able to do what the previous generation CPUs couldn't do and then do it at double the frame rate, which is just mind-blowing already. And then we looked into scenarios where I tried very slow, which again is 100% not built to run in real time, and very slow still isn't usable in real time, but performed better than normal slow did on the previous generation CPUs. And then we got talking about how it would be more reasonable until we get a higher bit rate available on Twitch for 6 and 8 megabits per second to stream 720p 120 FPS as a nice balance between not being too crunchy with the macro blocking at 1080p and still having a smooth quality at a high resolution. Now, some people do stream at 936p as a middle ground. They don't stream at 900p anymore because that's not divisible by 8, which causes browsers without hardware accelerated decoding to have screen tearing, which is annoying. 936p doesn't. However, in every test I've ever done, there is no significant difference between 1080p and 936p to make it worth it. It is just as blocky pretty much as 1080p and not sharp enough compared to 720p to be worth it. 720p is fine. That is the sweet spot. So we started looking at that as our target for the cheaper, the $300 12600K CPU to stream at. The 12600K is not capable of streaming 1080p 120 at slow, but it's close enough that I think we're going to start seeing a lot more movement to 120 FPS streaming for those who want to do it. The 12600K is capable of streaming 720p 120 FPS on medium, which still looks great, looks fantastic, and it's capable of streaming 1080p 60 FPS on medium as well. Now, this is for single PC streaming setups where you're playing the game on the same PC that you're streaming from. Now, I want to clarify because this, I guess I wasn't clear enough when I was originally streaming it. A lot of people got confused. This isn't about the game's in-game frame rate, because that's usually way higher than 120 FPS or around locked to 120 FPS. This is talking about streaming 120 individual frames per second of video to the feed to then watch back on a 120 hertz or higher monitor and it look a lot smoother. When you set up the 12600K as a dual PC setup where it's feeding another input, console or PC, in this case, again, the Xbox Series S, which is capable of outputting 1440p at 120 hertz, and Master Chief Collection runs at 120 FPS. I'm able to stream 1080p 60 on slow and 1080p 120 on medium, which again is just mind-boggling. This isn't possible on any other generation of non-HEDT CPUs that I review. HEDT is the high-end desktop platform like Intel's X299, so the 7980XE, 10980XE, etc., and the Threadripper 2000 and 3000 CPUs. They can sometimes stream 1080p 60 slow if you manage your core affinity and put in a lot of work for it, but they are much more expensive platforms, and it still requires work. Like, they don't just do it out of the box in most cases, and most of them aren't doing these kinds of specs at 120 FPS either, which is game-changing. Like, this is what this video is about, is we are seeing the beginning of the shift towards higher frame rate video broadcasts in live real time being possible, not just for slow-mo, and that's pretty wild. I know Riot has mentioned that they're interested in getting 120 FPS streaming going for their broadcasts and things like that, and we're seeing it possible on the independent creator level right now with Alder Lake, and it is incredible. Of course, I also ran the 12600K through the Puget benchmarks to see how the video editing performance would fare for DaVinci Resolve and Adobe Premiere Pro. You can see the scores compared to the 12900K and 11900K up now. Future EposVox here. Just wanted to note that the 12600K just wipes the floor with the 11900K in both Resolve and Premiere Pro. And weirdly enough, in Premiere Pro, it does better than the 12900K, which obviously should not be correct. It could be just Windows struggling to assign things to the right cores, or it could be something else worth exploring in a future video. But needless to say, the $300 CPU is still completely a fine choice. Just to show you real quick here, but then let's talk about what is required for 120 FPS streaming. Because if I'm saying this is game-changing, if I'm saying this is the future of streaming, what do we need for it? Because there's some obvious limitations here. So first and foremost, currently with the existing live streaming ecosystem going, you can stream just about any frame rate to Twitch and the source feed will spit that back out. We were able to even feed Twitch 240 FPS and it was streaming, if you go to the stats for nerds or whatever, it was streaming 240 FPS back out to the viewer if the viewer was capable of playing it. Obviously, the player isn't designed at the moment to keep up with high frame rates, but it's possible, and it does it. The quality selection, however, will only list 60 as the highest frame rate possible, even though it's, if you go to the stats for nerds, it is streaming higher than 60. That's just a UI thing. It's hard-coded. It's not flexible. But you can currently stream higher than 60 FPS to Twitch. You can stream even 240 FPS to Twitch, and it will play back to the viewer if the viewer is capable of playing it. However, you start to run into some downsides. So I have a Twitch channel that is pretty much, I'm only an affiliate, so I'm not guaranteed transcoding, but it has been counted on one hand since 2017 the number of times I have not gotten transcoding when I live stream. I pretty much always get it. I have never once gotten transcoding when I push higher than 60 FPS, and I'm pretty sure at the moment on Twitch, if you push higher than 60 FPS, you lose transcoding and it only sends the source quality, which is fine if your viewers are capable of playing it back, because of course then you run into the issue of not everybody watching your stream has 120 hertz screens. Now you do have some viewers who are even on smartphones with 120 hertz screens or watching on gaming monitors that support 120 hertz, but that won't be everybody. Now, thankfully, it seems at the moment at least, if you're watching on a 60 hertz screen, it will just kind of play back in 60 hertz and mostly be fine. It'll just drop those duplicate frames or whatever, but you can run into issues where it will actually look less smooth because of frame pacing issues or something like that on mixed refresh rate displays. But that's kind of always an issue. Like if you're watching a 60 hertz video on 144 hertz or 165 hertz or 100 hertz or something like that, you're still gonna have that issue anyway. So I don't know how big of a concern that is. But there will be a shift required on Twitch's infrastructure to actually start allowing this with transcoding in mind. And I think it would be smartest if Twitch enables transcoding to where you have a 60 FPS copy and a source frame rate copy, so that way everyone can get the feed relevant to their display, I guess. And of course, bandwidth is still a concern. The whole reason that I said we were waiting for that AV1 codec, which is a lot more bandwidth efficient, meaning that you need less bits to get the same quality as H.264. H.264 is what we're using right now, and H.264 isn't super bitrate efficient, and streaming the same bitrate but at double the frames means you're losing half the quality potentially. It usually works out to like, when you double your frames, you need 1.5x the bitrate, not 2x the bitrate, but you still lose a significant chunk of quality. Now, if you've been streaming at 6 megabits per second and you feel comfortable bumping it up to 7,500 kilobits per second or 8 megabits per second, then you do have a little bit of quality you can claw back. But again, you need your viewers to be able to watch that. And if your viewers don't have the high bandwidth pipe to watch it, which is especially a problem on mobile, which is why transcoding is a thing and why people stream lower bit rates, then you're kind of stuck. So there's a little bit of an infrastructural change here that will be required on Twitch's part. On YouTube, you're just kind of stuck. You can't feed YouTube 120 FPS and get it back out. YouTube transcodes everything, and they have locked format support at the moment. What you will generally be able to get away with is streaming 120 FPS to YouTube, and then it will just knock it down to 60. But the way that it does that could result in poor frame pacing, and mostly there's no point because no viewer is going to see it in 120 FPS, and that is unfortunate. YouTube streaming has a few issues like that. Like if you stream 24 FPS, it will upconvert it to 30 FPS and it looks bad. So some issues there. However, I do think YouTube is in the prime position to support 120 FPS streaming right now if they wanted to, assuming their servers are capable of dealing with it, because they do transcode everything, meaning you can feed them a high bandwidth pipe if you wanted, and viewers will get transcoded copies and be able to watch the quality that their network supports. But also, they do support H.265 streaming right now. There's no real way to do it other than a couple specific niche programs, as I showcased in my HDR streaming tutorial, where you could stream HDR and H.265 with Marilla's Action. No other program seems to support it right now, and I thought I could rig it up with a plugin in OBS Studio, and that is not the case. So those of you who keep asking about that video, it's not really coming anytime soon. It's not possible yet. I was wrong. But between their transcoding capabilities, the fact that they already support AV1, like to display to the viewers if they wanted to activate those servers, and the fact that you can send a very high bandwidth pipe to YouTube in the first place, I believe that they would be capable of enabling 120 FPS playback fairly quickly. And as my moderator Icelord mentioned as we were doing our tests last night on Twitch, seeing 120 FPS playback on Twitch is kind of bringing back that feeling that we had whenever YouTube first flipped on the switch for 60 FPS videos, because there was a time where YouTube only played back 30 FPS or lower, and you didn't have 60 FPS gameplay. But a lot of people who used, especially like Blackmagic kind of era broadcast capture cards, where you were forced to capture in the frame rate that your console spat out, which was 60 because they operate at 60 hertz. A lot of people were uploading 60 hertz videos without really realizing what they were doing. And so when YouTube flipped that switch to enable 60 FPS encoding, they actually went back and retranscoded all of the videos that had been uploaded back to YouTube's history. And suddenly we had 60 FPS videos going as far back as 2007. And it was really cool to see those older gameplay videos again in a smoother frame rate. And theoretically, we could have something happen with YouTube if they flip a switch for 120 FPS video. My only concern is they announced that they no longer keep your source files for very long. Used to, they kept them forever. Now they only keep them for 6 months or so. So theoretically, they won't be able to go back and scan a back catalog if you uploaded a 120 FPS video forever ago and upconvert it. So that would be disappointing. But I do believe they are in the position to do it. But there are other elements involved. Your stream graphics probably aren't 120 FPS, so the frame pacing with those could get awkward. We don't have webcams with 120 FPS. I feel like it would be kind of silly in the year we literally just got this year functional 60 FPS webcams that actually display 60 frames per second. It feels weird to then turn around and demand, all right, time to up it to 120. But we could start seeing some demand for that for people who want to keep their face in line with their gameplay and synced up like that. I personally don't find it hugely important, as even a 30 FPS webcam with 60 FPS gameplay looks totally fine, and most viewers can't even tell anyway, especially with the small face cam, but the demand will be there. And then we start running into some issues when it comes to actual broadcasts. Like I mentioned that Riot was pushing for 120 FPS broadcasts for Twitch, and we're probably involved in Twitch really diving down the rabbit hole of AV1 and getting it working. Converting a broadcast, like an actual broadcast workflow, not an indie streamer workflow, but like an esports event broadcast workflow to 120 hertz, where you have 120 FPS broadcast cameras going at that full speed and everything else, would be a monumental shift. And I don't know that anyone's ready for that yet. I know there are broadcast cameras capable of it and yada yada, but realistically converting that whole workflow to it, I don't know how quickly they could pull it off. I'm sure a company like Riot pumping enough money into it, someone's gonna race to be first, but we're not gonna see a ton of broadcasts like that just yet. And that may be a downer for some people, but we're getting there. I wanna talk to my contacts at Twitch and at YouTube to push some buttons now that this is possible with this context in mind and included. But I want to hear what you all think about 120 FPS streaming. Do you think it's the future? Do you think it's needed at all? Are you interested in pursuing it? Let me know what you think over on our Discord server at discord.gg/EposVox. I'm EposVox, the stream professor. Hope you enjoyed. Remember, be kind, rewind. Go check out that Forerunner album for backing track. It's freaking awesome.